Hi everyone, welcome back. In today's lesson, we are going to talk about church reforms and the Crusades. We're going to discuss how the church went through a series of revamps and reforms because things were getting a little bit dicey in their eyes. And then we're going to continue our discussion into about what the Crusades were. What were they, what happened, and what were some of the effects of them. So make sure you're in your interactive notebook and you're following along. Okay, so we're on page 6 of your interactive notebook. Again, we're talking about some church reforms, and ultimately we're going to be discussing the Crusades. So let's start off with our essential question for today. Again, we're going to focus primarily in this lesson more about the Crusades. So our essential question is, what were the purposes of the Crusades? So let's go ahead and get started. Let's first talk about this time period kind of as a whole. This time period, kind of starting about the 900s, becomes really an age of faith. People are very devoted to the Christian faith, as well as other faiths throughout the different regions. Not everybody was practicing Christianity, but there are people all throughout the lands that are tied to some sort of religion, and they're very faithful to that religion. So in the 900s, different monasteries start to pop up, and they really help with this spiritual revival. Reformers start to come in and help restore and expand the church power. We do start to see some problems in the church, however. And you'll remember in previous lessons, I talked about how there's going to be some problems with authority figures and the church, the kings, those who are in power versus, say, the Pope. And we are going to start to see in this lesson how some of that starts to come to be. So some of the problems that we see in the church at this time is that some church officials are getting married. There are some strict laws, we'll say, or canon law within the Catholic Church that says that priests aren't supposed to marry. But during this time period, some of them were. So that's kind of going against that law, and people are starting to question that. Should they really get married because they're not supposed to? They're supposed to be devoted to God. So there are some problems there. So again, some church officials are getting married, even though the church specifically objects to that. We also start to see that some officials are practicing something called simony, which is when you sell a religious office, or you sell, hey, give me some money, you can be this position. So some people are like, that seems a little bit dicey. The church is profiting off people so they can get a job. I don't really like that either. We also see that kings are using a process known as lay investiture, where they can appoint bishops. Really, where bishops should come from, where they should come from, or who should appoint them is the church. So the king shouldn't be appointing people. It should be officials in the church. So again, people start thinking some dicey things are taking place. The king's kind of involved where he shouldn't be. The church is involved where they shouldn't be. So it's kind of becoming a little muddled. So people are starting to question some of their faith. So let's bring about some church reform. By the 1100s, the Pope chimes in, or the popes, there's a string of them, and they start to say, let's reform our system to be kind of more like a kingdom. The Pope's going to be at the top. I think of the Pope as the king of the church, we'll say. And then any of their advisors that are below them are going to help make the church laws. A lot of them start to travel throughout Europe and kind of spread the message, and kind of put rein in the strings, we'll say. The church also collects tithes, which are basically a tax, and they're going to use that money to care for the sick, the poor, the homeless, those who really, really need it. We do have a couple different orders of the church that pop up. There's one known as the Dominican order, the Franciscan order, and so we see kind of little sects or different, what do I want to call them? Branching out of them. We're going to see within these orders, friars come in, and they're going to take a vow of poverty, meaning they have no worldly possessions, things don't matter to them. They live in the monasteries, things like that. They're going to travel, they're going to preach, and they're going to reach out to the poor. We also see more orders and more roles for women that come into this as well. So that's, yay, ladies. This time period also, we see kind of a revival in the structure of a cathedral. Early cathedrals, say between 800 and 1100, were built in what was known as the Romanesque style. They had real thick walls, big pillars, very small windows, lots of arches. But we have a new structure or a new style that comes out during this time period known as Gothic. This evolves and comes out around the 1100s, and the term Goth kind of came from these Germanic tribes that we talked about at the beginning of this lesson, or from this unit. This new style has large, tall windows that bring in more light. They have very pointed arches as opposed to the rounded arches, and you'll see the two different pictures here to kind of compare and contrast. These churches have stained glass windows. They have lots of different sculptures within them, and in about 500 of these types of churches are built between 1170 and 1270. So within about a 100-year period, they get about 500 of these types of churches built, or these cathedrals. So it's just kind of a new way, a new thing, a new style, a new trend during this time period. And a lot of these churches are still standing today. All right, so let's shift and talk about the Crusades. There are a lot of Crusades. There's a lot of stuff that went down, and we're not going to talk about it all here because I know you don't want to be sitting here listening to this all day long. So we're going to kind of keep it short and sweet. As always, go out and do extra research. If it's something that interests you, by all means. Think about when we get to the unit assessment, if it seems very interesting to you, this is something you can expand upon with your own research. But let's try and get through this short and sweet and quick as possible. By 1093, the emperor at the time of the Byzantine Empire, you remember the Byzantine Empire was when Rome split in half. It was the other side of the Roman Empire. He asked for help in fighting a group known as the Turks. Pope Urban II says, okay, we'll come in and help you. We're going to call this the Crusades, or we're going to call it a crusade. And crusade is another term for a holy war. They actually go in, some of the goals for the Crusades is that they want to go in and reclaim the territory known as Jerusalem. Jerusalem, even till today, is a very hot spot. A lot of different faiths claim that their spiritual deity, their religion stems from this land. The Christians say, Jerusalem was very big for them for Jesus Christ. The Jewish faith, the Judaism faith holds it for the Hebrews. The Muslim faith and there's a lot of claim to this area. So, this area has been fought over for centuries. But the Pope decides with the Crusades, he wants to reclaim Jerusalem and reunite Christianity. So the kings, they decide to use the Crusades as a way to send knights away. At this time, we have a lot of knights that are kind of squabbling for power and kind of fighting with each other and kind of getting themselves into trouble. So the king says, well, this is a great way to say, oh, go off and fight into the Crusades. And as terrible as it sounds, like maybe they won't come back. So they use it as that. Some of the younger population sees it as a way to kind of go off and prove themselves, to, get land, to get glory, to kind of puff up their chest that, oh, I fought in the Crusades and I came back and look, I'm a war hero. So they see it as a way for glory. And then finally, we also see that different merchants join in the Crusades to try and gain wealth through trade, because the Crusades are going to span a lot of time as well as a lot of distance. Let's break this down. We have about 5 Crusades. Like I said, it wasn't just like this one little thing that happened. It spanned quite some time. There are multiple Crusades. So the first and second Crusades in a nutshell. The Pope does promise any Crusaders, if you happen to perish in battle while fighting in the name of the Crusades, you are guaranteed a spot in heaven. So that does motivate a lot of these knights to be like, yeah, I want to join up because I want my one-way ticket, my guaranteed punch ticket into heaven. But the first crusade is where 3 armies, they gathered at Constantinople. You'll remember that was the capital of the Byzantine Empire. They gather in 1097 in Constantinople. And they are able to, by 1099, they're able to capture Jerusalem. They also capture most of the land along the coast, and they divide it into 4 Crusader states. The Muslims take back a place called Edessa in 1144. And during the Second Crusade, the Crusaders they fail to retake it. So the First and Second Crusades are kind of all about like Jerusalem and this strip of land. By 1187, a guy named Saladin, he was a Muslim leader and a Kurdish warrior. He takes back Jerusalem. So the First Crusade, it's back in the name of the Christians. By the Second Crusade, Jerusalem is back in the name of the Muslims. The Third Crusade was led by three powerful rulers. We had Richard the Lionhearted he was the King of England. We had Philip II of France, and then we had a guy by the name of Frederick I from Germany. Richard the Lionheart and Philip II kind of get into a big squabble. Philip's like, all right, I'm done, like, deuces, I'm out of here, guy, because I can't, like, agree with you. And then Frederick I actually drowns during the Third Crusade, so the guy who's victorious here is Richard the Lionhearted. So by 1192, Richard and our old friend Saladin, they make peace after quite some battles, and they agree that Saladin is going to keep Jerusalem in the name of the Muslims, but he is going to allow Christians to enter the city when they make their pilgrimages. Is a big thing in both the Christian and the Catholic, or the Christian, the Catholic, the Muslim, the Jewish faith, to make this kind of pilgrimage to your holy land. And again, Jerusalem is like the holy land for so many religions. So he said they can come in on their pilgrimage. We kind of own it, but they can come in. Some of the later crusades include the Fourth Crusade is basically the Crusaders. This is where it starts to kind of fall apart and just kind of like meander. We have Crusaders that looted the city of Constantinople in 1204. Two other crusades struck in Egypt, but they failed to weaken the power of the Muslims. We had something known as the Children's Crusade, where unfortunately in 1212, thousands of children either died or they were enslaved after another failed crusade. We had the Spanish Crusade. Most of Spain was controlled at the time by a group called the Moors, which was basically a Muslim people. And from 1100 to 1492, the Christians fought something known as the Reconquista, and they tried to drive the Muslims out of Spain. The Spain also had the Spanish Inquisition, where the court tried to suppress heresy, and they expelled any non-Christians. So in a nutshell, a very short nutshell, that was the Crusades. It started off as this holy war to reclaim Jerusalem in the name of the Christians, and then it just kind of became this hot mess of let's just keep going and plundering and pillaging, and not kind of dicey by the end. So what are some of the effects of the Crusades? The Crusades showed first and foremost that the power of the church was very convincing in trying to get people to fight in the name of the church. Like they just like, go do this. And people were like, okay. So very interesting at the time. It gave some more power to women, because when men went off to fight, kind of for the first time, women had to manage the affairs at home that the men had left. So again, it gives women a little bit more of a status upgrade. Merchants were able to expand trade. They brought back a lot of goods from Southwest Asia because those trading routes were open at the time. So again, a lot of those traders went along with it so they could profit from it. And then again, that failure of the later Crusades, it starts to weaken the Pope. And again, as I talked about at the beginning of this lesson, we're going to start to see this power struggle between the Pope, the nobles, the kings, and things like that. So the failure of the later Crusades takes some power away from the Pope and starts to bump up the power of the king and the nobles. Finally, the Crusades created basically a bitter taste between the Muslims and the Christians. You know, this idea of constantly fighting over the Holy Land, over Jerusalem, over power. It's something that's still around today. You know, we're still fighting over this. The land in Jerusalem is still a hot territory. Israel is still a hot territory where Jerusalem is. So the Crusades, again, lots of different effects, both pros and cons, but ultimately, in my opinion, it was kind of a hot mess. So make sure this is in your interactive notebook. Thanks for following along, and we'll see you next time.